This is Changemakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
I'm back with Bryan Greene, the Vice President of Policy Advocacy at the National Association of Realtors. Bryan has been sharing his powerful personal story of growing up in the highly segregated borough of Queens, New York, and how those experiences shaped his commitment to fighting housing discrimination. So, Bryan, let's talk about your day job. What inspired your transition to the real estate industry? And tell us a little bit about your role at NAR and how you've been able to work through a basically different sort of angle on affordable housing.
So I joined the National Association of Realtors in 2019 as its first director of fair housing policy. And so in some ways, that was a natural jump from enforcing those laws at the federal government to being able to work with an association that was looking to do more and recognize that, while it had been addressing issues of diversity in the industry and it had, in the past, equal opportunity committees that would weigh in from time to time on fair housing, it did not have a dedicated governance committee on fair housing. So they created that and sought me out to lead that committee as a staff executive and to develop policy for the National Association of Realtors. And almost immediately, I say immediately, like within the first 2 weeks on my job, there was a big expose of discrimination on Long Island. Newsday did a series called Long Island Divided, all about housing discrimination on Long Island, and they used hidden cameras and testers to show how agents were treating home buyers of different races differently, and showed the level of discrimination that Asians faced and Hispanics faced and African Americans faced vis-a-vis whites. Like I said, I'm from Queens. I know Long Island very well, and I recognized what I saw, but it was just even more painful because you actually saw what they were telling white people versus what they're telling black people. And, in those tests, the African Americans and Hispanics and Asians sometimes thought they were being treated fairly. And it was only when they saw how whites had been treated and just what they had been told. And sometimes, the agents explicitly discourage whites from living in the very areas that they told blacks and Hispanics were great places for them. Some of these testers cried, because they saw how these agents had sized them up. And so immediately we recognized that despite the National Association of Realtors having a code of ethics against discrimination and having spoken up in support of fair housing in recent decades, that there was still a problem. And so I had to develop initiatives to really get at the root of this. And so I created an initiative which I called really a raft of things that just conveniently I could call ACT, A-C-T exclamation point, which was the ways in which that we were going to ensure greater accountability. That's the A. Culture change, the C. And more effective training, the T. And so we made great investments in doing this. And, beyond, training that had traditionally been provided, we said we need to do more effective interactive training. We created a fantastic simulation so that people could better put themselves in the transaction from different perspectives and make sure that they understood, what was expected of them. But, in terms of culture change, just from the top, emphasizing how important fair housing is to the prosperity of our country, and creating opportunity and lifting up those people in our industry who are champions. So we've been doing that consistently. But I've always emphasized the accountability part, that something has to happen when people discriminate. And so we set about working with the different state and local associations to help them improve their state licensing laws so there are actual consequences when people engage in discrimination. So that's been a big push and priority. We also created a self-testing program so brokerages could test themselves, so that rather than reading about their company, say in the local newspaper, they could find out what their agents are doing and take corrective action. And then the last thing I'll say is we also have just re-upped our support for federal funding for the enforcement of the fair housing laws, and we've been strong supporters of other legislation and regulations that would strengthen fair housing enforcement. So that was all just in the first year of my job. And then I took on roles beyond that as vice president, addressing all of our policy advocacy. And so while most of the committees that I deal with aren't explicitly addressing fair housing, I'm always aware of how these issues touch on each other, and make sure that my team is working collaboratively. So, if we are making tax policy, if we're making environmental policy, or doing something in mortgage finance or valuations, we are alert to fair housing equities in those things.
What an unfortunate scenario for you to walk into. However, you were the right person at the right time to be able to exert a program and an initiative exactly like you just explained. So nothing is as motivating as being confronted with that reality, was there?
That's a silver lining. Yeah, I mean, within a month or two, I had this expanded budget, and it was just kind of like it helped illustrate the job I had to do. It made us leaders on this, and I don't think people have traditionally thought of the National Association of Realtors as leaders. We did, after all, oppose the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which even many of our members don't realize. And so now I think we are recognized as outspoken on fair housing as an advocate.
When you think about ground floor change agents, though, your members are exactly who we're talking about.
That's right. Like I said, the culture change almost anywhere in any industry, we're social creatures. And so people are influenced by what others are doing. Just the same, if you looked at that Newsday expose, it appears to me that, people do what they think the people around them want them to do. But if there are more high profile examples where folks emphasize, the right thing, and that there's no harm to doing the right thing, that it actually benefits not just the customers, but also the agents, then I think that becomes the culture. And so we just had a big national conference in Washington, D.C., where we recognized what we call our fair housing champions. And this was something we did in concert with Realtor.com. And these fair housing champions were announced on the first day at the opening event of this conference. And, we have 8,000 people who come to this conference. So in this big general session, when they were announced, and when there was a video, several minute video profiling each of them, they were asked to stand up, and they got a rousing standing ovation from all the realtors in attendance. And that's what we need to do. We need to, we need to highlight these folks as great professionals in our industry. We shouldn't have to, but nevertheless, because of our nation's history, we really do need to be more proactive in celebrating folks who are making a difference.
This is a learning process, but we sure need to learn it fast. And this ACT initiative and your Fair Housing Champions are a great example of how your members are taking these ideas to heart, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I'll point out that most of the work that I initiated was in late 2019, early 2020. And then, we had the pandemic. And then late May, George Floyd was killed. Then many, many more people across the country, began to do some soul searching, but also history research to better understand how we got to where we are. And of course, that story of George Floyd's killing illuminated how segregated Minneapolis, Minnesota is, and how that segregation shapes people's lives. It became just additional ballast for the work that we had started. And then, all throughout the country, people wanted to do more. And, there were excesses there too. And I think many sort of performative gestures and people kind of catching the football and running in the wrong direction. And, so I did spend some time, and my colleagues did spend some time talking to state associations and brokerages about what we thought were the most meaningful and constructive efforts they could engage in that would make a difference, which included, looking at their laws and the enforcement of their laws when it comes to housing discrimination issues, looking at policy and what policy either created barriers or perpetuated barriers. So we've spent a lot of time looking at these things. One of the things that I have helped introduce to the National Association of Realtors has been this whole matter of heirs property, and the fact that all throughout America, African Americans in particular, but many Americans over the decades have lost housing because housing and land, I should say, land is really sort of the big issue, have lost property because they didn't have wills, or the property inherited from their ancestors was not properly deeded. And so millions and millions of acres of African American land has been lost millions and millions of dollars, I should say, of African American land has been lost this way, say, over the last century. Whole areas have been developed as resorts like Hilton Head and Myrtle Beach and places from land that once was African American farmland, but was wrested away because poor African Americans, had not been able to inherit it with wills and deeds. And so it was easy for speculators to exploit them and take away the land. But that happens, still throughout the country. And like I say, it's been dramatic. I want to say that African Americans today own a fraction of the land that they owned 100 years ago because of these practices. So this is an issue that there are scholars who've been working on this, and they've been working state by state to create more protections for people who are in these heirs properties situations.
I was just going to ask you that, so I'm glad you mentioned it, because are there emerging trends in housing policy that you think are needed or that you're particularly watching?
Right. Well, this is one, and I'm pleased that in Washington, D.C., more policymakers and thought leaders are focusing on this. Fannie Mae just had a big conference on this. No one was talking about this 4 years ago when I began stressing it at the National Association of Realtors. We issued policy on it, I want to say 2021, just because we, that's what we do. We create policy then that allows our associations to go forward and lobby state houses and Congress. And so we recognize this as a huge property rights issue, to the extent that any policymakers are trying to make efforts to close the homeownership gaps among different racial groups. This seems like a critical piece to make sure that the land that people have had in their families for generations isn't now wrested away from them because people can exploit the deed or lack of deeds.
Let's talk about this homeownership gap, especially with where the market is right now. What is your association's official policy, or how are you guys moving in that domain? Is that part of your initiatives?
Yeah, no, I mean, we have emphasized the need to close the homeownership gap. Right now, white Americans have a homeownership rate of about 74%. Asian Americans, I think about 61%. Hispanic Americans, 51%, and African Americans at about 44, 45%. And so that gap between African Americans and whites is about 30 percentage points. And as I said earlier, is likely to be exacerbated during this housing shortage, which is making housing less affordable. And, right now, the average American can't afford the median home price. Actually, I would say the majority of Americans cannot. And it's even more acute for people of color for all the historical reasons I've cited. So we see addressing housing supply, which is really one of our top legislative priorities, to do more to promote federal policy that would create more housing. We see that as key to at least stabilizing things in this country, but it also ultimately is going to create more affordability too, which could help narrow that gap. In the meantime and going forward, we have stressed the need for down payment assistance. So we have policy supporting federal, state, and local down payment assistance programs. We've always supported employer-based down payment assistance programs, and we're seeing more efforts along those lines that we want to support. The credit modernization I mentioned before is also key to making sure that people are in the best credit position. It's unfortunate that we're only doing this now. It's kind of surprising to me that we're only doing this now, where we're recognizing the importance of rental payments in that respect. And then we're just lifting up the other issues like student loan debt and how that contributes. But no doubt, having less money is also going to impact your credit, because the cost of everything is the same regardless of your income. And so if you just have less money, you're going to be more burdened. And so you see that with respect to education, but you see it also, the cost of eggs or cost of transportation. There are not discounts based on your income. So that's always going to lead to downward pressure on people's credit. So we've got to find ways to fix these things, or at least make sure that the playing field truly is level. If there's appraisal discrimination, we need to address that as well, because you don't want people finding that even once they own a home, it's devalued. So all of these factors are critically important to beginning to close the home ownership gap. And then, there are other efforts underway, like special purpose credit programs, where private lenders are creating programs that recognize historical discrimination. And so that they're creating programs that target those communities, programs that will help benefit those populations that have faced past discrimination. It's quite incredible that in 1976, Gerald Ford signed into law the Equal Credit Opportunity Act amendments, which had this provision which said that lenders can support lending programs that favor groups that have been historically discriminated against. And many lenders just never utilized it. After 2020, many realized, there is something we can do that is in the law. And they checked in with HUD and said, okay, this kind of preferential program would not violate the Fair Housing Act. And HUD said, no, it would actually be consistent with the Fair Housing Act. It's in another federal law, and it's addressing the same things the Fair Housing Act was enacted to address. And so lenders have begun utilizing it. They're proceeding somewhat haltingly, and I think the country still has a lot of challenges when it comes to doing anything that's explicitly reparative. But and they're afraid that they'll be challenged in the courts. But at least it's a recognition that what caused these disparities, and that it was a recent harm, and that there are people alive today who are directly harmed by these discriminatory actions and policies of federal government and industry, and that we should hold ourselves accountable to try to address it.
Those are all emerging trends in housing policy that I'm really hoping that several of those come to fruition in our lifetimes and that we're able to tackle those more efficiently. I would also be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for that employee down payment assistance grant or program that you mentioned. We at Quadell just rolled one out for the first time in our 40 years of being a company, and we've been in the affordable housing world. So I like to put in a plug for any of the other employer groups who are listening, because there's so many different models out there. This is something that you don't even have to reinvent the wheel, and you can push forward as doing your own piece in this larger issue.
I agree. I think there's a lot that private entities can do, private employers. It obviously pays dividends for those companies. So I think it's great to make those investments in your company, and it's a small way to do it, to look after your own people. And by extension, if more and more companies are doing that, we help the broader population.
Yep. We just had Ned Williams from the Michaels organization on our podcast, and he really focuses on, he's a development firm, and he focuses on a lot of workforce and attainable housing, and he partners with hospitals and schools and even Disney. And this is such an important trend and an important avenue for increasing some of that supply and really having a much larger footprint as opposed to just those traditional financing models that are out there. Well, Bryan, this has been fantastic to have you here and give us perspective on what you're doing and what you've done and what is still to do, correct? So I appreciate your time here.
It's been my pleasure. I'm glad that you are providing a platform and a space for these ideas. And I think as more and more people become better educated on the issues and what's needed, we'll begin to see meaningful change.
Bryan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadell.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.